You're listening to the Catholic Accent Podcast. In this podcast, we discuss the acts and miracles that Jesus performed that stunned his disciples. Today's topic is the woman at the well. I'm Jordan Whiteko, along with Father Andrew Hamilton and Father Christopher Pujol. Ready, guys?
Ready.
And we're back. Just kidding.
Thanks, Jordan, for that round of applause.
in our studio. Okay, let's just jump right in. The woman at the well. I know the stunned disciples come a little bit later, so set the stage of who the woman at the well is. In the gospel, the disciples were surprised that Jesus was talking to her.
Oh, everyone would have been because, she, first of all, was a Samaritan. And even before we get into her questionable living situation...
Now, can you explain first what a Samaritan?
Absolutely. So the Samaritans were an offshoot of the Jewish people, and they intermarried with their conquerors when Rome came in. And so they weren't clean. They weren't seen to be clean by your mainstream Jews. They had their own temple. They didn't worship with them. They did their own sacrifices. So it was almost like two parallel religions, but they were definitely seen as lower people, unclean, and your average Jew could not contact them.
It's like two rival high schools that really hate each other.
It's like Valley and Borough.
One of the ways that we would know this, too, is because, for example, when they would go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which you had to at the main feasts of the year in the Jewish calendar, the Jewish people in Galilee, where Jesus was from, would go around. They'd go across the Jordan River, and then down, and then they would come back up through Jericho. So we know basically exactly where John the Baptist was baptized because that's Jesus coming up through there, and then up to Jerusalem. But they would go around Samaria. So they'd literally take a long route around Samaria so as not to
just so they didn't even have to get close to it.
All right, thank you. Go on. Explain who she is and why they would be surprised.
She had an interesting past, as Father had alluded to. He was building the scene there.
She would be what we would say a little promiscuous.
Gotcha.
But something that should give pause, I think, and Father, feel free to chime in. She's going to the well in the middle of the day. Now, we're in Israel. It's hot. I mean, we've been having record heat waves here, right? And here she is out in the desert going for water at the hottest point of the day. Anyone else would have gone first thing in the morning or in the evening when it was a little bit cooler.
So contextually, basically, it's laying out for us that she's somewhat outcast from her peers.
Even within the Samaritan group, she's outcast.
Oh, wow.
And this would have been work that basically women had done to go get the water from the well to then bring back to the home. So the other women of her society seemingly did not want to associate with her, whether they felt guilty by association or whatever it was. And so she didn't feel welcome then, and so that's why she's going towards the middle part of the day, which then leads into her encounter with Jesus, who comes to the well in the midst of the day.
And she was surprised by Jesus as well. It wasn't just one...
Oh, yeah, she would have been very surprised because really as a man, he should not have been alone with her, and she should not have been alone with him because they're not related. There's no context there with them, and yet he goes to her. And he would know that she was an outcast, not only that she was a Samaritan and he should stay away, but that she's there by herself. He should have gone nowhere nearby in a cultural context. And like we see this in today's culture too, right? Like we see groups of people that are outcasts and we try to stay away from them. But in reality, we're called to reach out and go to them. And so this is where Christ is setting that scene for the Christian mission to go to all people. And so he goes and it's like, give me a drink of water. I'm thirsty. Like, I just got back from the beach.
It's the hottest point of the day.
It's
like,
hot.
I need some water.
And that, like, the sand's blowing. It's hitting you. I was just at the beach, and it was blowing one day. And I'm laying there, and the sand's pelting me in the face. I thought, I got to go inside. Well, this poor woman, she's trying to get a cup of water. It's going to be all sandy. And yet, Jesus goes and says, I'm thirsty. And what does she do?
Well, she basically leads right into with, who are you? Right? That would be the first thing that you would ask somebody, especially. And she already knew what we get from the scriptures that he was Jewish. So it's playing upon that interaction between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. Why would you as a Jew be talking to me, a Samaritan, and especially a Samaritan woman? And so then Jesus starts to basically look into her life. well, who are you, right? He kind of flips it around on us. Often when we ask who God is, we start to learn actually our own identity through that lens. And he's picking up on the fact that this is just water. Your thirst will come back. I'm what you actually want, that will provide for you forever, and you will go without thirst then.
But it doesn't end there. So as this whole scene's playing out, we see that this ancestral well, right? It's the well of Jacob. And the well has not run dry in a very, very long time. And so last episode, you were asking about all this abundance of wine.
Yeah.
And this plays right into that the abundance of God doesn't run dry. But in this life, we continue to thirst and we continue to have those earthly needs that we need met. But here Christ is saying to this woman, even though she's not in communion with him, she's not in communion with her people, that by drawing on him spiritually and by changing her life, she will receive the graces necessary. And that's the whole point of the story. And not that it was real nice that he shared with this woman, but it was that after he realizes and calls her out on her sinfulness, she stops and her life is changed. It's that whole experience of metanoia, that whole conversion.
And there's a risk in both. Like that's one thing to highlight, certainly, that God takes a risk, right? It says that we share nothing in common as Jews and Samaritans. We were talking about in the last episode with the water jars being for ritual cleansing. Huge context that we don't really get in our modern day. You had to do certain things to be ritually clean so that you could offer sacrifice at the temple. Their entire mindset was a religious one in ancient Judaism. Whereas, like, sadly, we kind of have sometimes people 1 hour on a Sunday, that's maybe your religious attitude or experience.
And then it gets lost the rest of the week.
Right. This is what they did. And so if you couldn't then be ritually clean to go offer sacrifice, you were really, like, in some sense, set apart from society. So you wanted to reconcile that or avoid things that would make you ritualistically unclean.
Being unclean separates you from God and from your community. And we'll see this all throughout the scriptures, I'm sure, as we continue this series, that in every miracle, there's a restoration of the individual to the community and the individual to God.
So what was the miracle, if you will, of this woman at the well with Jesus? Just that he talked to her, he knew so much about her, and brought her to the faith?
I think the acceptance of the community of her through the message of Jesus. So whenever she becomes basically, after meeting Jesus and realizing that he is the Messiah, her going back into the community that has ostracized her and doesn't want anything to do with her, but because of her message that she then takes to them, she becomes a great proclaimer of the good news. And from there, then, is accepted back into the community. And so that's really the miracle, because with all of her husbands before in her past and everything else like that and baggage, she probably never believed that she would be part of the community anymore and that she could have a future with them. But yet the Lord provided a way, a path, even when it was unseen.
And I think today, too, we hear Pope Francis talking about accompaniment and walking with each other. And this is really setting a model for that. But Bishop Kulik often reminds us that walking with someone doesn't mean that we walk them over a cliff. We meet them where they are, we walk, and then they have to have that changed experience. But we can't force that on someone. And so you never see in this passage Jesus forcing the woman to do anything. But rather, after that experience of seeing Christ, her life is changed, paused, and then she can change the lives of others.
And I think the quote is, Jesus says, "My food is to do the will of the one who sent me and to finish his work." So he's referring what you just said, that this is the work of God. I'm here to do that work. Follow me.
Which is a nice contrast, right? That he says that, but yet he sent his disciples to go into town to get food, presumably for him, right? So they come back with all this food in hand, and they're like, "Oh, hey, we got this for you."
And
then
He's like, "Look at my new friend."
And he's basically, "I'm not hungry. I've already eaten. This is the work that we're doing, right? This is the food for the journey that you're taking, which is to save souls." And people that are in maybe the business of saving souls, you understand there's something that nourishes your soul in ministry more than having a really fine meal with a good steak and a glass of wine. And it's people coming to you and saying, "I found Jesus. I found something more here, and my life has changed for the better." I can live off of that
Oh, yeah.
for weeks on end.
And reverse that and see that Christ truly is the food. He becomes the food. He becomes the Eucharist. And so in that, he's now feeding this woman. He's feeding with his life, with his mission, with his identity as the Son of God. And all of this is playing out in a way that this is the great difference between Christianity and the rest of the world, right? Everyone else is man's search for God. But in Christianity, it's God's search for man. And he's the one who's looking for us.
Somebody famous said that before.
Yeah,
Father
not me.
Chris.
Don't
No,
quote
of
me
course
on
not.
that.
So and that woman becomes a missionary of Jesus. Does the woman have a name? Is there a name?
The
is she just
Samaritan woman.
a Samaritan
Great
woman? I just
mystery,
was
yeah.
curious. I didn't want to just keep referring to her as the woman if she had
Which
a name.
in many ways helps to kind of just say it's like a more wide term that
Oh,
like
for
it's
sure.
like that you read yourself into that. That
Man
person.
or
So-
woman.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Is she accepted again once she starts or is she still kind of that outcast?
They have to see in some way to accept the message of Jesus. Like after he comes there, like she's preaching to them, but then like once they actually themselves meet the Lord, then they realize like what they've been missing. And then there's a
Absolutely.
community that then forms around that.
And we even hear, the Samaritans began to believe because of the woman's testimony. And so if you look at it like in a courtroom, right, the Samaritan community becomes the jury. And somehow now this testimony of the woman is showing them that not only she's been changed, but their lives are going to be changed when they come to recognize who Jesus is. And then the most scandalous part is this woman, the community that can have nothing to do with Jesus or his disciples or your average Jewish community, says to him, "Come and stay with us." And what's he do? "Sure, I'd love to." I mean, that would have blown the disciples' minds. And guess what? None of them became unclean because they had community with each other. He's taking the laws of the time and showing that that's not the end-all, be-all. Yes, they're important.
And I think the whole point of law, right, is kind of you need these guardrails when you're kind of a little bit
Swerving,
of
just like when Father drives.
a little bit of
After
a
the
younger
wedding.
driver.
Yeah, after the wedding it came.
But so basically, when you're young, and you don't have the skills, you need something to kind of hone you in.
Just like good parents do.
Right. It's like the bumpers on like if you're at a bowling alley.
Yeah.
Get yourself
Get
a
the
little bit of
bumpers.
confidence with the bumpers. It gets you down the lane. And then when you come to a better, mature, fuller sense of bowling, you don't need them anymore and you're throwing strikes. So this is what Jesus is doing with the law, that the law was placed for an immature Israel that needed all of these things
And
to help them.
protection.
And then now they have to see what the law was actually for, which was guiding them towards the principle of gathering the nations together.
To himself, because Christ is the law. The last line of this passage is so critical because it's not the Jewish people recognizing who Jesus is, but it's this outcast group who says, quote, "This truly is the Savior of the world." They've seen now the completion of the covenants, and they see him as the one who is the law, the prophets, all together, while his own people continue to reject him.
I think it's like tongue in cheek sometimes
Yeah.
from John and some of the other writers that what's given as examples of faith in Christ are people that would be least likely
To
accept
believe.
the message, or they're outside of what is the house of Israel or understanding of people. And so they kind of shame those Jewish
The
people
believers,
that grew
right.
up with Jesus, that are around him all the time, that the
That heard him
familiarity
in the
has
temple.
led to, yeah.
The woman from the well was amazed by Jesus. When have you been amazed by Jesus that you want to share the good news with others?
I think every morning I'm amazed. Some days I wake up and think, how could this kid be a priest now? And I know Father probably thinks similar.
Do you?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I didn't see myself being a priest whatsoever. I was amazed by like the simplest line, which also comes from the Gospel of John, right? God is love, essentially. And that's something in catechism you're taught, and it's told to you all the time. And it's like, okay, what's that really mean? It becomes cliche. You hear it so often, which cliches are something that has a truth to it, but it's said so often that you just discard it, essentially. And for me, the great love of God reaching out, as Father Chris talked about before, that God comes into this world so as to be with us and try to save us, even though he doesn't need to. God's perfect in himself, doesn't need us, but rather comes into this world to raise us up even in the midst of suffering, taking that on for himself, that's what changed my life. And so from there, that's where I start to pray. That's where I start to actually talk to people about Jesus and not think religion is just like some like weird thing that like, you know, people that need like mental help do or something else like that, right?
It's not like a self-help group or, you know, just like a club for us to hang out in and, you know, ring bells and burn incense, but it's a life-changing reality. And I think for me, every day, you know, there are moments that stun you, right? Whether it's in the confessional, saying mass, or simply encountering someone on the street. And then when you start to really live out the gospel, you start to encounter Christ in these profound ways, just like the woman at the well met Christ.
And I think the woman at the well meets Jesus at a low point in her life. And I'm big on this, that sometimes even in the midst of darkness, you meet the light of the world and you find your way forward. And I think that that's really true and speaks to a culture where we seemingly have everything that we would need. We're the most material wealthy country in the history of the world in the United States. And what are people still doing? Looking for meaning. It's obviously not found in money. It's not found in things that we could possess or have. It's found in God. And so we have to have kind of this religious reawakening to look back to the person that really matters in the midst of all of this world, which is Jesus himself, who then gives us our mission. And from there, we have a purpose.
And we have to stop running from those dark moments. You know, we over-medicate ourselves just so we don't have to feel that darkness or feel alone. But it's in those very moments that Christ came for. And that's where he wants to seek, and that's where we can reach out and find him so immensely with a great love and a great hope. But I think also we have to realize, too, that Jesus, through this woman, is showing us that we should never be ashamed. We should have a feeling of maybe regret, a feeling knowing that we did something wrong.
But there's an inherent dignity
to us as people, as sons and daughters of God. And so we should never be ashamed to go to him in our problems, even when it seems that everyone has cast us out.
Yeah.
It's that great point of
He'll accept you.
and then we accept him. And then the great love story continues.
Thanks for listening to the Catholic Accent Podcast. Don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe to our show.
Nice to meet you at the well.
Drink up.